Unless there are any more questions, we'll move on to the next presentation, which is from Paul Stoneman. And he's going to be talking about some data which is looking at the UK's civic culture and looking at trust in government and political participation.
Well, Joe must have a crystal ball, actually, because what you just mentioned about spending time online, should that be classed as a civic act? Well, actually, in this presentation, that's what I'm going to argue for, is that online activities and our use of the media actually helps in developing the nation's civic culture. Yeah. So what I'm going to actually do is give you an analysis of Britain's civic culture, and I've seen political scientists do this for decades, and what they often do is they provide you with a measurement of a nation's civic culture, and then they compare that with other countries' civic culture, but use different measurements, so it's not comparative at all. But using the European Social Survey, what I can do here is actually, with reference to time use variables, is give you an understanding of what's actually going on out there in terms of people's political participation, and actually compare these levels with other West European countries. And what I'm going to go on to argue for is that use of technologies actually contributes to the nation's civic culture by developing civic literacy, which is something that Bernard Crick is actually interested in, as recommended to the government that citizenship be part of our national curriculum. And basically it's saying that we can know things about politics and we can know facts, but what we need is people to actually actively participate, to learn the virtues of politics, to learn how to cooperate, to learn how to compromise. And technologies can aid that. Just before I start, can I just have a show of hands to see how many people believe that they're actually interested in politics and that they actually participate on a regular basis? That's pretty much everybody. Well, there's a theory that says you're mad, quite frankly. And the reason for this is the free rider problem. There's a collective action problem, which is the free rider problem. Nobody's vote in this room has ever changed the outcome of an election, be it at the constituency level or general election level. So it's not surprising that we actually look at time use data, and we find that overwhelming majority, nearly 90% of people don't actually participate at all. This has led to some political science saying that in actually most of us are free riding on the efforts of a very small minority in the population who do all this work, do all the lobbying, do all the work in secondary associations, join a political party, actually turn up for meetings if they're really crazy. And this all filters into how we perceive citizenship. In the 1950s, we had a very rigid view of what it is to be a citizen. The only requirements of a citizen in the 1950s was that they voted. As the government got a larger role, political parties began to separate. It was required of citizens to really make themselves familiar with what was going on in the party system. So throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s, we had this strict polarisation between the two main parties, and every citizen really, in order to navigate the political world, had to be aware of what was going on in the party system. Now, with more instrumental rationality of the parties, reliance on focus groups and conversion on the centre ground, the idea of what it means to be a citizen goes beyond that now. It's not good enough merely to vote, it's not good enough merely to know who the chancellor is. We have to actually get out there and do things. This is Putnam's view of democracy. So we can use these measures of political participation to actually tap into this thing called civic culture. These 5 acts is what I've been focusing on this issue in this presentation. And we can actually tap into these 5 measures of political participation by using data mainly from the European Social Survey, but also a variable from the MTUS. So this is just one variable from the MTUS that compares the amount of time that respondents report to have allocated to civic activities. And as you can see, amongst these 5 nations, the UK doesn't score very well at all. In actual fact, in Essex and Chimera, on average, the average citizen there devotes nearly twice as much time to civic activities as the UK. And obviously the big statistic that's been borne out through past two general elections is that turnout rate is falling. So us in France, compared to Scandinavian countries, really are struggling to have high levels of participation in general elections. And what this usually reflects is dissatisfaction with the party system. And these are just percentages of the population are actually members of the political party. So as you can see, you're a real oddball. If you're a member of a political party, you're weird. You're not representative of the average person. And again, relatively speaking, we score extremely low on that. This is an aggregated variable. It's time spent using the media and the internet for current affairs information. And again, relative to other West European countries, we score extremely low on that. On average, around 38 minutes per day is spent doing that compared to 44, 45 minutes. Doesn't seem like big differences, but if you have a whole population spending that extra few minutes acquiring this information, it can make a big difference to civic culture. If you're not inclined to seek out information, you're less inclined to discuss politics. So we find a correlation between information searching and actually discussing politics with other people. This is a social capital measure. It's basically tapping into people's, whether they have joined organisations like an environmental group, lobbying group, women's institute, local associations and so forth. And as you can see, again, we score extremely low on this. And at this point I was getting quite depressed because I thought, well, what is it we actually do? Well, apparently, relative to other nations, we like to protest. We're more inclined to sign a petition and attend a public demonstration than other West European. Now, the trouble with this is that it might be that in Portugal, it's not that they're not civically minded, it's just that life's great. We don't know that. But then I look at the other end and see countries like Sweden and Norway who do have a decent quality of life, and yet their willingness to actually get out there and vent spleen towards the government is quite high. The final measure is boycott and boycott. And again, it seems that people in terms of politics don't think about it in terms of very conventional ways of it. It's very personal, it's very ethical. So on this scale, relatively speaking, we're actually quite good at saying no to unethical products and saying yes to more ethical ones. Now what we can do with all these measures is we can attach scores, civic culture scores. So for instance, in this variable, this group here would get a score of -1. These countries in the middle here would get 0. And then 4 countries in the end would get a score of 1. And what this gives us is an overall score of a nation's civic culture. And as you can see, we're not doing too well. And the nature of our civic culture at the moment is that formal conventional methods of participation we're not actually interested in. The only things that we score reasonably well on are those more unconventional forms of participation, like protesting and boycotting. Now the question is, how do technologies feed into a nation's civic culture? Well, something that was preempted by Joe is that, well, they actually allow us to get hands on this information. Particularly with the internet, they've made it a lot easier. And what we can do is we can take those individuals who use TV, radio, internet and newspapers and see whether their usage actually correlates with a higher interest in politics and a higher level of discussion of politics. And because interest in discussing politics can also be a product of age and education, I've put this into a regression model, and basically a regression model which just allows us to produce coefficients, correlation coefficients that control for other factors. So what we're saying is, regardless of age, gender and education, usage of TV, radio, internet, newspapers actually stimulates interest and provokes discussion. So in a nutshell, it enhances civic literacy. And what I've done here is I've begun to start looking at the structure of these political acts. And this is just a factor analysis, and factor analysis will just tell us what's going on there, where these behaviours cluster. And as you can see in the first column, this suggests that there are people out there who are joining in voluntary organisations, who are participating in protests and boycotting. They're not really doing any much of the voting and the party membership stuff. And then on this other side, we have people who are voted, who are inclined to vote, who like to join a party, but they're not really doing all this other stuff, these more unconventional, informal activities. But what we can see here is the importance of civic literacy, this use of the media in discussing politics. Because regardless of what type of political activity you're interested in, the one thing that binds them is this use of the media for information and discussing politics. So it really is a driving force behind all forms of political participation. We can actually present that spatially. So this just highlights how these behaviours cluster together and how using the media for information and discussing politics actually mediates between the two. It overlaps with both forms. And what was interesting to me was actually to start breaking this variable down, which is the use of media, by the different types of technologies you can use to access that information. We have the radio, TV, newspapers, and the internet. And we break that variable down, and what we find is that the conventional ways of getting information, newspapers, radio, and TV, actually clusters with the conventional acts. Whereas over here, using the internet for political information clusters with these unconventional forms of activities. And as soon as I presented this data to one of my friends, he said, but that's just an artifact. You're getting these clustering together because these people here using the internet are young people, young educated people. That's why they're clustering with all these unconventional behaviours. So I decided to run another regression, controlling for age, gender, education again. Also in the model, I'm controlling for each of these other behaviours as well. So, for instance, when I'm trying to predict the impact of a newspaper on the inclination to vote, I'm also controlling for internet users and radio users. So this is sort of like the main effects, whilst controlling for all other relevant factors. And as we can see, is that reading a newspaper actually correlates with a greater inclination to vote. The internet has an impact on the social capital measures of voluntary organisations, and also on these informal acts of protesting and boycotting. And finally, the radio, listening to the radio for public information seems to have quite a big, significant impact on these informal acts of protesting and boycotting.
Can I just ask a quick question about that? When you put that, if you're reading a newspaper, you're more likely to vote, have you just highlighted that because if you read a newspaper, does that not have an effect on the others listed on the right-hand side? And with the others, you've just highlighted the area where you can see a clear impact.
I've only shown the coefficients that are actually significant.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And you see, nothing actually predicts joining the political party. Again, this goes back to, party members are freaks. We don't know who they are, what they do, and why they join the party. We have no idea why. So one of the things that could have happened is that the internet has actually provoked a response in our civic culture, a different response. People are moving away from the conventional acts, moving towards these more informal acts, and perhaps the internet is actually supporting this shift. But I don't think that's actually the case. Changes in these formal participation has been declining prior to the introduction of the internet. Membership in parties has actually been hemorrhaging since the 1970s. Trust in government has been declining continuously throughout the 70s, 80s and 90s. So timing of it doesn't match. The shift in Britain's political culture occurred before the introduction of the internet and the use of these new technologies. The real reason why people are switching from formal participation to more informal participation is because they're simply pissed off with the party system. This graph shows the perceived difference between the two main parties. This is the line that says people believe there's a great difference between the two main parties. This is the line, the yellow line, that says there's not much difference. And as you can see, 1997 was a watershed election year because it was the last time that people actually believed there was some difference between the two main parties. After that, they believe they're pretty much the same. And it's not surprisingly in 2001 that we actually get that 59% electoral turnout, which is low since 1918. So I think actually the introduction of the internet has been timely. It's come at a time when people have become disengaged with party politics. They don't really trust what politicians say anymore. It didn't create that, but it's come after that. And what it's actually done is created a space now in which people can still be politically active, even though they're disengaged from mainstream politics. The regression models that I showed earlier actually show that use of the mass media actually supports political participation. There's a hell of a lot of literature out there that says the mass media are to blame for cynicism, the internet is keeping people home, which stops them politically participating. But as Joe quite rightly pointed out, that in itself has been adopted as a new way of participation, which is what Ben was saying as well. It's a new way of doing old things. And my results here are actually informed by somebody else called Stephen Ward, who's actually a fellow at Oxford, I think, at the moment. He works on the Democracy and Participation project, and he's actually done a close analysis of people using the internet and what they were like before using the internet and what they were like afterwards. And all respondents actually expressed greater sense of political efficacy, greater sense of trust, and they've actually gone on to join lots of secondary organisations, particularly environmental and human rights groups. So what we can tell relative to other Western nations is that, formally speaking, in terms of the conventional political acts, we have a very, very weak civic culture. We're just not interested in mainstream politics like we used to be before relative to other countries. It's a misnomer to blame the mass media, it's a misnomer to blame the internet. This is purely a response to factors that are going on with the political system. The explanations are all endogenous to political systems. It's nothing to do with social change at all. But thankfully the internet come along at a good time, because as we were getting disengaged with mainstream politics, the internet has given us an avenue to actually still be politically active. And as the statistics earlier pointed out, it's actually allowing us to be active in ways that we weren't active before. Secondary organisations, protest and sign petitions. But we can't go too far about this. Just because the internet is actually supporting some forms of participation for some people, it's not going to revolutionise politics. It's not going to bring the voter, the average citizen, closer to the political process. That is due to wider social changes, and that is due to factors with the party system, and the internet really isn't going to overcome these problems. That's for politicians and parties to sort out.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Any questions? Responses?
Yeah,
you look like you were about to.
Mark Spalrick, DTI. I find it very difficult to say for you to conclude that it's the political parties that have caused his interest in politics. You could just as easily say it's because people are recognising that actually the capability of political parties to actually deliver any meaningful change is constrained by the fact that we live in a global society now. So, people might recognise that actually voting for one party in the long run isn't going to make a lot of difference, because a lot of the things that affect us in our everyday life are outside of their control. So it's not necessarily political parties themselves that are at fault, it's the changing world in which we live in. Lots of other things. You sort of dismiss the media as a reason why people are disengaging. But if you look at the quality of our newspapers, and I wondered in that graph where you show, relevance of people reading newspapers and the like and their engagement, to what extent you looked at the quality of the press in those respective countries, because it's not surprising people don't engage if they read the Sun or News of the World or whatever, because those papers do not try and deliver those sorts of messages or sense of civic duty as part of their core deliverables.
Sure. Well, the first point, I take it what you're saying is that people had an unreasonable expectation about what government can do, and now they're basically just being more reasonable about what to do. But somebody actually increased those expectations in the first place. Political parties have a history of promising things that either A, they don't intend to do, or B, they can't do. So somebody actually made citizens believe that these parties can actually come along and make significant differences. Every single manifesto, every single election time, these parties promise things that they cannot fulfil.
But I'd turn that on its head and say that if a political leader came out and told the truth, he or she would be committing suicide, because basically the electorate are not prepared to listen to the truth. I mean, the truth of the matter is, right? The truth of the matter is that we need people to stop driving their cars today, right? Mm-hmm. But if a political leader came out tomorrow and said, right, I'm increasing the duty on fuel by 300%, I'm putting up the price of, gas and electricity to stop you burning up the planet, do you think they get elected? No, of course they wouldn't. So the reality is, people don't want to hear the truth. They want to live in a little bubble and ignore as much as possible what's going on around them.
But that presupposes that unilateral action of one country would make a difference, and we know that it wouldn't. So you can't say that the electorate is to blame. It's the
electorate don't want to hear some of the truth.
But it's not just an electorate; it's an electorate across, say, the whole of Europe. Because it's only if it's regional, if you get some bilateral change, then that would be true. That if we all stopped, if the whole of Europe stopped, changed its practices, stopped driving, if we got rid of 3/4 of the number of cars on the road across Europe, that would make an ecological impact on the region. But if only one country does it, it won't make a difference, because it will get the impact from other countries.
But that's a recipe for the total inertia. You just say, well, we're not going to do anything until they do something, and then
Should we have Paul respond?
Can I just pick up? Yeah, I mean, you're saying that. I think you're right. Politicians will not tell the electorate the truth because they don't think it's politically viable to tell them. That's indicative of the problem. That's precisely the problem. They're not going to tell the electorate the truth. They're going to play their party games, their political games, in order to try and maximise their share of the vote. Now, the second point you made about usage of media. Now, Ken Newton, Pippa Norris, a couple of political scientists, they've actually compared non-users of the media, so people who don't read any form of newspaper, for instance, looked at tabloid readers and looked at those who read the broadsheets. And what they found is there's absolutely no difference between political efficacy, trust, participant rate between non-users and tabloid users. The only effect they can find is that if you read a broadsheet newspaper, it's likely just to increase your levels of trust and participation slightly. So in fact, there isn't difference between media audiences. There just isn't the variance there to actually say that the media can have an impact. And the way that the media actually operates, it operates like a market. It doesn't actually change the way people think. It gives them what they already think. It might frame the agenda, but it's not actually going to change the way people think.
Yep.
I'm James Howard-Jones from the BBC. I'm amazed how much new technology with PowerPoint is stimulating political participation, so I thought, which was meant as a gag, but anyway, we'll speak now. What I wondered was, thinking about the chicken and egg, and I don't want this to be a bash Paul kind of moment, but I was wondering genuinely how much of the results of kind of increased participation might be down to things like there being big kind of things out there in people's minds, be it Iraq, Afghanistan, terror, etc., over the data period where the internet, in terms of penetration, has crept in, and whether that was kind of factored in and controlled for in any way.
No, it wasn't. I think you're right. Participation is always going to fluctuate according to the events that are going on. You're absolutely right. But what the internet does is actually it allows people to do things they wouldn't have already done before. Stephen Moore's actually done this. He's looked at what people were doing during the period of the Iraq War, the fuel crisis, etc. Looking at what actually people were doing if they didn't have internet access. Now, they wanted to join up to a lobbying group or to some association, a pressure group. But without the internet, they found themselves isolated. The group of users that did have internet access, they went and signed online. They got all this information. They were more stimulated. They actually felt they could do something because they saw other organisations there and other people signing these petitions online. So you're absolutely right. It does all depend on what's actually going on as well. But what we can say from these analyses and other analyses is that these new technologies are actually allowing the process of engagement to be easier.
And I guess through different kinds of channels as well, not just online.
Absolutely.
But I mean, there is this concern, isn't there, that a lot of people talk about online communities and participation in online communities as a kind of nichification of people, so an atomization around specific interests, and it's this issues-driven politics rather than the sort of party political system that we used to. I mean, is that tension, do you think, going to increase? And because how does the government respond, or how does our political system respond if people are more interested in issues rather than?
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, there's an article out there called "Running on the Spot," and what it says is that because the internet is so tailored to specific interests of the user, that all people are actually going to do is sort of block out all else that's going on and just focus on what they're interested in. And the thing is about watching the news at 10 or reading The Guardian is you're going to be exposed to information that you probably wouldn't ordinarily be exposed to, and it might develop new interests, and it might help you see the arguments of other people. But I think you're right, actually, that if people have got this technology they can use to really focus on the internet, and then government is going to be inundated with all these conflicting and separate interests, it could be a problem. But I don't think it will be, simply because TV and newspapers are still the main source of political information. I think people are using the internet for these other activities. I think they're still going to go to the conventional forms to learn about the party system, to learn about different policy strategies. And I think people are reasonable enough to be aware that there are other interests you have to take into account. People can compromise.
It's interesting.
Sorry, Kimberly.
I'm Kimberly Fisher. I'm from the Center for Time-Use Research at the University of Oxford. I wonder if you reach the conclusions that you do because you're using data from countries where things are politically a bit more comfortable at the moment. And the reason I say that is that I was in Argentina at the time of the currency collapse, and there were huge protests of hundreds of thousands of people coordinated across cities connected by mobile phone use, because they had a very good reason to be extremely upset. Now it's used for pillow fights, which is perhaps not quite so stimulating. But mobile phone and internet chat rooms have been linked with government change in places like Lebanon, and they have been linked with protests that have led to at least lower level policy change in parts of China. Even in this country, email and internet and phone networks got 900 Colchester United supporters out to overturn a council decision about the new stadium. Curious things happen, like Refugee Council volunteers found a Daily Mail website asking supporters to answer a question of if they thought immigrants were destroying the values of Britain, and it changed from 90% saying immigrants are destroying the values of Britain to 90% saying no, they're not, because of people networking with each other. So that was removed from the Daily Mail's website. But these sorts of civic actions perhaps are not as visible in the data yet here, because there hasn't been quite the same immediacy need to use them. But if you look at some of the more micro-level things, and if you look at how they're interacting in countries where things are more desperate, I think there might well be cause for hope that there is the potential for some kind of round in civic participation in these technologies.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I think what you're going on in the background, what you're saying there is that people participate when there is a reason to participate. One of these graphs that didn't really make sense to me is Sweden and Norway. Really. They have very high quality of life. They have strong ethic of compromise and ethic of culture. There isn't a big difference between those on the lowest end of society and those on the highest end. Looking at that, you think they were quite animated about politics. They're quite, they're nearly as likely as a Frenchman to go and take to the streets and protest. And of course, the French are renowned for having, a culture that says, "Look, this is the line. You cross it, we're going to protest." Norway and Sweden are not like that. They don't really have any reasons to be more to be active in politics now than they have been in the past 20, 30 years.
It might be interesting to pull apart surrounding position demo and all the different kind of pre-codes to what that variable is being grouped to do. Because it might be like a level of participation, and you might find France way protesting on the streets, whereas actually when you aggregate it up, there's a lot of participation in petition signing, and maybe kind of lower, more gentle forms. That's the hypothesis.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. There might be qualitatively different types of processes, you're right. But I still think this, even regardless of whether there's a reason to actually participate, I think what this capturing is still a willingness to participate, regardless of what's going on the political world. It still captures, if something happens, then I'm going to do something about it. I still think we're actually picking up that sort of disposition towards being actively engaged in the political process, regardless of what's going on in the political world.
Can I make a quick comment? I wonder, though, how much something like signing a petition or attending a demo, I think that's very much part of... I question, especially in the UK, how much that is a form of political protest, or if it's sort of joining a fashion, part of the consumer culture, really. And I wonder if you've looked at that at all, if there's any literature on the extent to which people going to anti-Iraq war demos, for example, are doing that because they passionately believe in the issue, or because it's fashionable and trendy and their friends will be there.
Yeah, you could be right. I mean, I actually, was part of the protest against the Iraq war, and I think I got the impression that some were along just for a giggle.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. I know of no data on that, though.
In which case, it possibly wouldn't be correct to link this form of civic participation, because it might not be a form of civic participation. Actually, it might just be another form of consumerism.
You're right. I think you'd have to do more individual level work to see whether this clusters with voting as well, and whether it clusters with using the internet for political information. And if you find somebody who does voting, who's a member of a party, who's like that, then you could probably be confident that they're not just turning up for a laugh.
Yeah.
But you're right, if somebody scores 0 and everything else, but loves to protest, okay, you could be sceptical. You're right.
Joe,
okay.
Come back to what you're saying. Can you do the next slide? About how should the government respond? Well, surely they should take advantage of this fact that we like to boycott and boycott.
Yes.
And they don't have to make the career cataclysmic statement that we're going to stop driving cars. But what they can do is leverage this ability for people to act privately, an inclination for people to act privately, and incentivise, which of course is partly what they're trying to do, maybe a bit too rapid in the faces. If you can take advantage of this, then surely you can shift the population where you want them to be without them thinking that it's actually a political act and caring about it, because they're prepared to do this because it's a privatisation of action, in a sense, and privatisation of civic culture, privatisation of media, and all that word privatisation. What I mean.
Oh, you're right. I mean, because they should. I mean, in terms of environmental strategy, they shouldn't be pitching environmental behaviour in terms of normative terms. Like, you ought to be doing this because the planet's going to die. They say, look, you should be doing this because you'll save money. The thrifty and the environmental go hand in hand.
Okay, well, let's break there for coffee. Thank you very much, Paul.